All right, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation in the FusionReactor webinar series. My name is Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next half hour to an hour. And this first of a four-part series is going to be on troubleshooting with FusionReactor, what's just happened on my server. And that's really important to understand, because if you don't have a good tool, you won't know what's going on the server, and you may just think, well, let's just stop and start it, and then people will restart their box, or they'll restart their application server. And by that, I mean Cold Fusion, Lucy, or whatever Java application server you might be running. FusionReactor can monitor all those things. And if you're stuck wondering what to do, and all you think to do is restart it, you're not really solving the problem. You're just kind of ripping the Band-Aid off. Oh, thanks. So let's go ahead and get started. So again, my name is Charlie Earhart. I'm an independent consultant. I don't work for the company that makes FusionReactor, but I work with them. I've done most of the past 14 of the 15 webinars that we've done so far, and they're all on different topics, and I'll talk about those later, so you can catch up on those if you haven't seen them. And I just pretty much focus on troubleshooting servers all day, every day, with about 1,000 clients I have had over the past 10 years. And I'm often showing them how to use FusionReactor and make the most of it, but whatever tools they have, I'll help them use those. But I do recommend FusionReactor. I've found that it does the best job of all the ones that I've seen before. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, it's going to be nearly all demos, so don't worry, it's not going to be a bunch of slides. After a quick introduction of some other kind of details, then we'll dive right in. And first we'll talk about what I would regard as the first thing everybody should be watching, and that's the web metrics feature of FusionReactor, which tells you what's going on currently and recently. So we'll dive into that in a moment. And then once you know that there are requests running, if that's your issue, then there's a way to see what requests are running right now, and that's the request activity page. And a lot of people don't even know about this, don't think about it, because their head's not in the game of what's going on with requests. They're focused on other things. So we'll talk about that and why it's important. And then you might want to see what's been going on recently. So there's a request history page, and slow request, and longest request, and I'll explain the difference between those. And then there's a recent errors page. So you can look at requests error history to see if you've had application errors in your application server. And then finally, you might wonder why I listed this last, but a lot of people presume their problems are CPU or memory problems, and they may not be. So I don't want to focus on that first. I want to focus on those other things first. But it might be that you have a CPU or a memory issue, and there's ways to watch that in FusionReactor as well, and in greater detail than you might have ever thought was possible. And then finally, when we're talking about memory, many people's brains go to garbage collection, the Java JVM garbage collection. And good news, FusionReactor has great insight into that. And so here's my point, is you could help find out if that is or is not a problem. So in the old days, people were just guessing at stuff and think, well, maybe we need to tweak our JVM arguments. Maybe we need to change our garbage collection algorithm. If you could look at FusionReactor's garbage collection mechanism and say, nope, it shows that nothing's wrong there, then you know that's not your issue, and you can move on. So anyway, that'll be it for the things we'll cover in this part one. And if you've not yet seen it on the webinars page at fusion-reactor.com, you can see what part 2 and 3 and 4 will be, and they will cover very different topics. There's much more to see about FusionReactor. And in the meantime, I'll point you to resources for learning more, including those past webinars that we've done, and docs for getting started with FusionReactor and getting a trial. And there is a free trial if you're new to FusionReactor, seeing this for the first time. There's a free 14-day trial that you can implement and try things out for yourself. And if you've got your own FusionReactor, go ahead and open it up and follow along in another tab. You might check out some things and learn something as we go. And then we'll leave time at the end for questions and answers. All right, so again, this is the first of a planned 4-part series. Part 2 will be on why are my requests or transactions running slowly? And we'll see in a moment what we mean by transactions, but we'll cover it more in the next presentation. So why are my requests or transactions running slowly? Today will be, are they? And then next time will be, why are they? And then sometimes the reason is for less obvious reasons. It's not going to be apparent as it would be with many problems. So part 3 will dig into some ways that FusionReactor lets you go even further in understanding why a request is slow when it's not obvious from the first set of features that are readily available. And then finally, the last part will be post-crash troubleshooting, meaning, well, what if your application server, like Cold Fusion, for instance, has restarted? you may know that FusionReactor only shows back to the time of the restart. But there are ways to dig in further, and if you're on FusionReactor 7.2 or above, there's a nice new archive metrics feature, so you don't have to dig through the logs like we used to. But I love that too. But these provide an interface. The archives metrics provides an interface. So we'll talk about that and alerting and things like that for part 4. Now about you, the audience, we're presuming that you do already use FusionReactor, but it's okay if you don't. You should be able to follow along anyway. But even if you're either new to it or been using it for a long time, you might be overwhelmed by how much there is in there and where do you turn to solve problems. So this series is meant to kind of get you started. And even if you're an old timer user, maybe show you some things you didn't know were even possible. And as I said already, the concepts apply to any Java or CFML server that FusionReactor can monitor. So Jetty, Glassfish, WebSphere, Tomcat, or ColdFusion, Lucy, even Blue Dragon server. And the presentation is being recorded, so you'll be able to come back and watch it again to capture some details that you might have missed the first time. Now, before we get started with looking at the tool, I'm going to lay some groundwork of things that I would argue from my experience that you should be aware of when you're going into such troubleshooting, because it's very easy to come in with some presumptions that will mislead you and take you down the wrong rabbit holes. Okay, so some things to keep in mind. First, don't presume that you know what the problem is. I know you may think you know, and you may Google something that suggests, aha, this is your problem based on some error message you saw or some circumstance that you interpreted, but just beware doing that. I don't presume you know what the problem is. It may be something you entirely didn't expect. And the whole point of having a tool like FusionReactor is it gives you insight to know what the problem really is. And it often may not be what you thought it was. And I hinted at this already, don't presume that the problem is about system resources, memory, CPU, the horsepower of your box, its ability to scale. I know that's reasonable to presume that must be your problem, especially when you're getting a lot of traffic and you think that's going to be your problem. Is this going to be able to scale? Is it our box? Is it our software? It may be none of those things. There may be no problem with those things at all. It may be something that you would just never have fathomed, and it might have nothing to do with the thing you're looking at. And that's the next point. Don't presume that the problem is within the instance or the app server that you're looking at. So again, let's say with ColdFusion for a moment, people often went, it's ColdFusion again. When are we getting off ColdFusion? We're going to move the node, whatever. The problem may not be with it. It may be with it being a victim of it calling out to something else, which may be some other platform that's supposed to be the golden child platform, and it may be hanging up. It could happen. And if your application calls out to another thing, and that thing is not responding, then your application looks to be the problem, but it's really the victim, okay? And again, we're gonna see how that's apparent with a tool like FusionReactor to be able to see. So keep that in mind. And then finally, just a couple more points. Don't presume that you know what your site's traffic levels are. You might think, well, this server doesn't get any traffic, it doesn't make any sense. Or this server is really busy and we're gonna always have trouble with it. It may not be as busy as you think. It may not be as lightly trafficked as you think. And I want to point out a couple things. One is that if you're basing your observations, your sense, your knowledge of how busy your site is on something like Google Analytics, well, just keep in mind that's based on requests executing some JavaScript tracking code. And there's a lot of kind of things that will visit your server that will not execute JavaScript code. Spiders, bots, hackers, monitoring tools, all kinds of stuff. Or automated agents, they won't execute that, and therefore Google Analytics could be totally underreporting your traffic. I've seen sites where 80% of their traffic was from automated clients, and Google Analytics was way underreporting the traffic. Similarly, some people focus on web server log analysis. Well, that's equally challenged because that's looking at every file that gets requested, not just requests to your application server. So that could overstate things. It could say you're getting, 20 requests per second or 200 requests per second, and you might only be getting, instead of 200, you might be getting 20 into your application server. Or instead of 20, you might be getting 2 per second into your application server. So the cool thing about FusionReactor is it tracks all and only requests that do make it into your application server. And that's really beneficial. So in case, again, of ColdFusion, it's going to only see ColdFusion page requests, CFMs, CFCs requested on a URL, like for AJAX call to a method in a CFC. That's all going to be tracked by FusionReactor. but not static files, not HTML, not images, JS, CSS. That would be littering the web server logs. FusionReactor's interface and logs won't have any of that. If you have a front web server that's handling that, that's the web server's job. And only what gets through to your application server will show up in FusionReactor. And again, I'm just saying that traffic may be a lot more or less than you expected based on that other monitoring. And knowing what's going on within the processing of your requests is the key to me, from my experience working with people. When they don't have a tool that shows what's going on in their application server, they just don't know. They don't know whether requests are running or none running or taking a long time, not taking a long time. They just don't know. And they insert debugging output and stuff like that. And that's a way to go. But the point is, FusionReactor makes it very easy to see. And a lot of other monitoring tools don't do this. So just let me make that point. You may have other tools people are trying to get you to use. When you see what you can see with FusionReactor, the question will be, can you see the same sort of stuff with those other monitoring tools? Because often they won't. They'll focus on the JVM. They'll focus on resources. They'll focus on response time, averages, and stuff like that. But can they show you what requests are running right now? Can they show you what those requests are doing? Can they show if a request is running a query right now? Can they show how long that query within that request has been running? Can they show you what line of code a request is running at a point in time? These are all things that FusionReactor can tell you. And if you don't have that insight, again, you're left with a black box thinking all you can do is restart it and hope the problem goes away. So that's what I want to show you today. So again, we're going to go over the various things I talked about earlier. And first up will be the web metrics page. So here we are looking at my particular website, Gerhardt.org. And it's very lightly loaded, so your site may look very different in the ranges of the values here, but let's just take a quick look at what this is telling us. So just to be clear, in case you're relatively new to FusionReactor, if you go to metrics, so all these buttons on the left have a pop-up, and if you go to metrics and then choose web metrics, that's the page I'm looking at right now. And I just want to give a quick clarification of what these are about, because I work with people who've been having FusionReactor for days or weeks and they didn't really understand what this page was about. And it says stuff, but if they just don't look at it, they just kind of glaze over it. So first, these two things are talking about requests. These two things are talking about JDBC activity. And then these two things are talking about system resources within CF for your JVM for the most part. So we'll come back to them in a moment. So first, about request activity. So this at the top, this is about either completed requests per second or running requests. Now, in my environment right now, you can see that I don't have a lot of traffic, a couple requests per second, sometimes none. Sometimes there's ones lasting for a little while. We'll talk about the duration in a moment. And then if I said, well, I can't tell, what's the light green versus the dark green, I just want you all to see that you can turn off something. So now I'm only focusing on what's running right now. Now, that's an important point too, because you might look at this and say, well, there's nothing running right now. Well, it's not that there's nothing running. It's that every 5 seconds when this graph says how many things are running, at that moment, none are running. Well, there's one that was running in the very moment. Now, again, normally you're going to see there's not too many running. That's my point. You're not going to have many running. If you do suddenly have many running, that's usually a problem, and that's what you want to dig into. So it's helpful to turn that off and say, do we have many running now or in recent time? And by the way, this is showing the last minute by default. Down in the bottom right corner, you can click on this and it changes all 6 graphs to being the last hour by default. And then this is averages over that hour. So sometimes even those little ones kind of disappear in the averages. It shows 0.1. Well, there wasn't 0.1 request, but this is 0.1 over, probably a 30-second time frame, because this is over an hour. So anyway, if I go back to the completed, so this is the average response, average number of requests per second. And again, I have a very lightly loaded server right now. Let me just show you, there is a demo site. If you don't have FusionReactor yourself and you want to see something yourself without just trusting this webinar, if you go to demo.fusion-reactor.com, demo.fusion-reactor.com, you could go do that right now and follow along if you want to. But really, don't get lost looking at that. You'll miss what I'm showing you. But I just want you to see, if you want to go visit it, get it in your browser, and then go and look at it later. This does have more traffic, a little bit more, 3 to 5 requests per second on average. Anyway, so let me get back to this, because this one has more features enabled. That demo has some features removed. Just because it's running as a particular mode, and let's not get into that right now. But it'll show you much of what it can do. Anyway, here we are. So again, we're looking at the last hour. Let me go back to the last minute. So this is just, without getting into the details of what requests are running, we'll see that in a moment. This is just how many are running, how many have run per second on average recently. And then down here is how long are they taking. So the dark blue is of the ones that completed, how long did they take? So again, average completed time. Of the ones that finished, how long did they take? And then of any that are running, how long are they taking? So I'm going to turn off the completed ones, and there you can see a light blue of a request that was running relatively long. You know, in my case, relatively long is 200 milliseconds, but you know, your numbers may be very different. That's not what matters. But the point is, you can come in here and see how you're doing generally. And as you can see there, our errors are tracked as well in terms of how many errors have happened and how long a request that have errors taking. We'll come back to some more about request activity in a moment, but let me move on to the database stuff. So while these requests are running, some of them are running queries, and some of them are running many queries. So in that moment, something ran, either one or many requests, led to a total of 300 queries per second. Now, again, some of you may see that all of your graph here shows things at 200 to 300 queries per second all the time. You know, I've designed my application so it doesn't do queries that often through caching and some other things, but it's nothing wrong if you're doing 200 queries per second. You know, one might argue you could improve that, but the point is just get to know what's normal for you. And when are things abnormal? Does it become 1,000? And then just as before, we can turn off completed, and then the question is, are any queries running at any point in time? And sometimes there are. There was a little moment there, just barely, where there was one running. Okay. And you can see down here, this is how long are queries taking. So in dark blue is what's the average response time of queries that are running. And when I say queries, I mean inserts, updates, deletes, stored procedure calls, ORM calls, any kind of JDBC activity that would be tracked here. And there was a moment where there was some average active time of 600 milliseconds. Again, I can turn off the finished ones and say, was there some query running slowly at the moment the graph caught it? And yes, there were some moments where some queries were running slowly. Again, that's average response time of running queries, and then the dark blue is average response time of completed queries. And sometimes they'll jive with each other, and sometimes they won't. All right, so that's that. Turn that back on just in case that becomes interesting to look at. You never know while you're watching, you know, just kind of keep your eyes on these graphs and see, like right there, clearly there were some long-running requests. I might want to go investigate those. I'll dig into that in a moment. Then up here is memory, and this is the heap. And by the way, it's only the heap. There's other parts of memory within the JVM that this doesn't focus on, but we'll see those later. And also, this is not looking at total memory on the box. It's just looking at memory within the heap. So it shows the heap used in dark orange, allocated in light orange, and then total, or max, you know, the max amount, your Xmax, your heap max is at the top. And in my case, it's only a gig. You might have 5 gigs or 10 gigs. Your numbers may be very different. But the point is, you can see that the JVM, the heap is going up and down, and there it did, just went on its own, went down. That means it did a garbage collection. We'll see more about that later, but it just did a garbage collection. If I wanted to force it to do one, I could click a button here, and I'll just go ahead and do that right now, and let's just see if it goes down even more. And again, we'll talk more about that later, but it said it recovered 200 meg, so it is going to drop. Sure enough, look at that, it dropped even further. And we won't get into too much depth here, but I'll talk a little bit more about garbage collection later and watching it. And then there's a whole webinar on troubleshooting memory issues with FusionReactor. Anyway, finally back to CPU. This is the bottom graph. The dark yellow is your instance's use of CPU. So in my case, Cold Fusion. In your case, it might be Lucy or Tomcat or WebSphere. The point is, you can see what the instance's use of CPU is, and then the light yellow is other CPU use on the box. And that's important because sometimes your problem is not in your application server. In fact, some of you may have noticed earlier, I'm going to go out to the last hour view, just a couple minutes ago, I noticed that there was a real high spike of non-instance CPU. Something else was running on my box. Look at that. It was using almost 60% of the CPU. 6% of it was my Cold Fusion instance. So the other 56%, you know, these are subsets, so 58 minus 2, so 52. So some 52% was something other than my instance. And FusionReactor doesn't have any insight into what that was. It's just telling me, hey, it wasn't my instance. It was something else. And that could be a problem. I've seen situations where either on average or in moments, there were very high non-instance CPU. So the problem is not the instance, it's something else. Could be an antivirus, could be a security scanner, could be somebody's got a browser open on the server and the browser is waiting for an update. I mean, I've literally seen something as simple as that. Somebody left a browser open on the server, disconnected from the remote desktop in the case of a Windows server, and had a browser open and thought, well, the browser's just sitting on a blank page. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal was I've seen browsers suddenly, when they want to do updates, if you don't respond to them for some reason, I've seen different browsers suddenly start to use more and more CPU simply waiting for you to run the update. And if you went into the server and closed the browser, you'd see FusionReactor show the CPU fall like a rock back down to now the CPU, like in I look right now, the CPU is barely above the CF use of CPU, in my case, CF. And that's normal. There's other stuff running. There's a web server running. I happen to actually have my database server on this machine because, again, it's very lightly loaded. I don't need to worry about that. You should not do that, but do as we say, not as we do. Cobbler's children doesn't have shoes. But it just doesn't, for me, it doesn't really matter because my database server doesn't do much, so it happens to run on the same box. Anyway, so that's the metrics, web metrics page. Lots of good stuff up there. There's much more I could show you, but in the interest of time, I need to move on. What I do want to talk about is there's also this text below the graphs. And this is very interesting. Now, I don't know why. I mean, I've had debates with the engineers about why they say server. This server doesn't mean server. It means your instance. When they say server here, they mean your instance. And so the instance started up for me. Gosh, is that yesterday? Wow, that's weird. For some reason, yesterday at 9 a.m., my server restarted. I wasn't paying attention, so I didn't notice that. I'm sure I got an email. But it must have been down only briefly because I didn't get any alerts. Anyway, my server, my instance has been up for 1 day, 17 minutes, and 25 seconds. So that's very helpful, too, to look at sometimes. Just come to the metrics, web metrics, and say, how's your server doing? If you come in here, it's only been up for an hour, that's not good, right? That means it restarted an hour ago. And if you didn't know that, it'd be really bad if it's restarting often. And there's ways, especially with FusionReactor, to be able to see how often it's restarting. We'll talk about that in part 4. Remember, post-crash troubleshooting. That'll be in part 4. For now, we're talking about this metrics. What can you see what's going on now? And you can see how many requests are running now. You can see how many requests have run since it came up, what's been the average response time, the current memory use, average query time, lots of interesting stuff. I'll leave you to explore this more later. Interestingly, down here, too, when we talk about errors, you can look and see what errors have happened recently in terms of status codes. I've had some 403s. If I click on that, it takes me to a page that focuses just on what 403s have I had, how often have they happened, when did they happen, and in a moment. That graph should just come up right away. There might be another moment of the CPU on my box being high. But there you go. It shows a graph of when the 403s have happened. And then down here, in most recent, descending order, the 100 most recent 403s that I've had. What was the URL? Look at that. Some bad guys trying to send in crap on the query string. The second line is the query string. Now, we're going to get to what these requests are in a moment, because that's the next thing to talk about. But this is looking at it from the perspective of error codes. And I could change to look at the other error codes up here by clicking this button. But let's get back to the metrics, web metrics. So the next thing we were going to talk about in terms of the demonstrations was the request pages. So that was a hint at that. If you look at requests, well, there's activity, what's going on now. There's history, the 100 most recent that have run. Error history, the 100 most recent errors that have run. Longest, which is the 100 longest that have been running since, that have run since the instance started. Slow is the 100 most recent that were slow, slow being defined by default 8 seconds or slower. So there's a difference between these two. I'll talk about that later. And then here's response codes, that thing we were just looking at, and some other things. I'll leave you to look at those. But I want to move on and say, let's look at request activity. So at the moment, do I have any requests running? And I don't. But let me just go fire one up. Give me just a moment to go to another browser and fire up a request. Sorry, I didn't have this ready to go. Should take me about 20 seconds to get going. Okay, so in a moment, we should see a long-running request appearing on that page. And this doesn't refresh automatically, so I'm going to hit the refresh button, and there I've kicked off 2 long-running requests. Now, let me just go back for a moment to the request. This is the metrics, web metrics, and we'll see this is reflected in light blue, some very long-running requests, And we can see that they're slow because they're running a query that's taken a long time. And the light green has popped up because I have 2 running requests. But again, if I go back to requests activity, I can see the details of those requests. I can see what's the URL, what's the query string, what was the IP address, okay? So those all can be very interesting things in and of themselves, but I can also dig into them to find out more. I'm going to click on the least recent of the 2. I might catch it still running. So I've just clicked on the URL, and yeah, I'm shown the details of that particular request. Again, there's that request, when it started, its IP, the URL, the query string, sorry, the application, and here's the query string and the URL. And here's, at the moment, it was 48 seconds old. Now, by now, it's finished. But before I leave the screen, let me just show you what I could have seen was going on at this moment, 48 seconds into its life. The first thing I always tell people is to look down here in the bottom right corner at how many queries are running and what's the total query total time. And are there any running queries? So there were none that had completed, and therefore the total was 0, but there was one that was running, and it was taking at that moment 48 seconds. 48 of the 48 seconds. Now, you may instead look at a situation where maybe you're looking at a request that's 30 seconds old, and 28 of the 30 seconds have been completed queries, and there might be 1 or 10 or 20 or 1,000 queries that have run. This is in this request. However many have run will be tracked, and how long they've taken will be tracked, and if any is running, how long has it been running? And then furthermore, you can come up to this JDBC tab and see the details about whatever queries either are running or have run. So in my case, there's only the one running, and yeah, it's doing an artificial wait for delay in SQL Server, but it's been running for 48 seconds. Remember, we're focused right now on running requests. I'll show you later ones that have been running and finished and what we would look at there. But anyway, you see the level of detail that you can see about requests, and you can also come back to this main tab where we saw this information. And there's other interesting information that you might want to explore. I'll leave you to look into that. And if there were headers sent in, you could see those headers, especially over here is request headers, like there's the user agent. And if you have the IP address is being hidden and you have an X forwarded for, there's the real IP address. And in another presentation called Configuring FusionReactor for Action, I show you how you can tell FusionReactor to use that X forwarded for header or whatever header you have to have FusionReactor show the real IP address. I've already done that, but again, that's not this presentation. I got to move on. If there's cookies coming in, there's the cookies, and then various other things that we'll talk about later. All right, so that's currently running requests. Now let's move on to recently run requests. So again, this is requests history. That's the 100 most recent requests that have completed. So here's my 100 most recent requests. And when I first look at this, I just want to kind of eyeball, have there been any slow? And no, mostly there have not. You know, under 300, 400 milliseconds, a couple 600, 359, but nothing terrible. Now, if I page down, there you go. There's the ones that I ran that took a long time. And you might want to do this, just kind of eyeball how are things been going recently. And this goes back for me to 9:26 on Central Time. So it's about 5 minutes I'm seeing. Now, again, you may see 100 requests in 2 seconds. It could happen. And so this may not be useful for you, but for some people, it can be useful to look at this and say, what's been going on recently? And how long ago would 100 requests have run? Then that gives you a general sense of how things have gone and what requests have run, how long they took. And then maybe you'll also eyeball for the ones that are slow. Is there anything about the URL or the query string? Is there anything about the IP address? Could any of those give you insight? But then you could dig into them and find out more about them. So let me see if I can find any other relatively slow request. The slowest one I have is that one that was 626 milliseconds. So I'm going to click on this one. Now I could also click on this little icon, but this is just easier. Just click on the URL. It doesn't run the page. It just takes you to the details of that request. Now, you may do that and find that it will complain that the request is gone because it's only going to keep the 100 most recent. So by the time you click it, it may be gone. But in my case, it wasn't gone. So there's that URL. There's how long it took. This number is how many milliseconds of CPU it took. And by the way, that's down here also in here, thread CPU time, 250. But then I always tell people, go right to the total query total time. And in my case, no, it's not query time. 26 milliseconds, only 4 queries ran. That doesn't account for another, at least 400 some, 300 some milliseconds. Where did they go? Now, it's only 300 milliseconds. I'm not really going to be able to dig into that. We'll talk about digging into more later. But you could dig in further to find out more. That's going to be in the third part, is when you can't readily explain why requests are slow. We'll cover that in the third part. So there's so much, I can't go into everything now. We'd never get finished. All right, so that's that. So then that was, you know, request history, the 100 most recent. Now I said that there was also this request, longest request. So this is since my instance has come up, would have been the 100 slowest ever since it came up. And so you may notice that these are from around the time I started my server. That'll happen, right? Sometimes when you first start up, things are slow. FusionReactor also tracks a request ID. Every request gets an ID. So this one is the 26,000th request, but this one's only the 7th. And sure enough, among the first couple, the slowest are among the first requests when the app restarted. So I'm not so much worried about that. But this one, well, it's that long DB wait that I just ran, and this one's the long DB wait. But here's another one. It was a call to my blog post. Why did this call to my blog post take 49 seconds? And again, I could dig into that and try to find out what that was about. But we've already covered that. I want to move on. So again, this is longest request, the 100 most long-running requests since the instance came up. That too may be useful. It's in duration order. You might sometimes find value in sorting it by finished order, because maybe you'll see that there's a pattern. So now we're looking at it since the instance came up. After that 909, you know, that was the first few minutes of CF, in my case, being up. Then there was 910, 911, 920, 9, and then we're moving on eventually to past that day of the 29th. And anywhere along here, you know, there's a bump of a bunch at around 1500, you know, where there wasn't any, but one at 1400 and only a couple at 1300. So you may sometimes find some pattern. I'm just saying, you never know what you may find when you look at this stuff. Now, then there was requests, slow requests. What's the difference with that? Well, slow requests is not in order of duration. It's the 100 most recent that were slow. And I said earlier, that's defined as 8 seconds. Now, again, there's a webinar on configuring FusionReactor for action where we talk about how to configure that setting. So let me leave you to look into that more later. But it is by default 8 seconds. And so you can see there's 8 seconds, 8 seconds, 9 seconds, 10 seconds, 18, 60. So anything that was 8 seconds or slower is tracked here. And it's the 100 most recent that were slow. So it's not in duration order. It's in recency order by default. Of course, you can change it. But again, this is useful because when I come to this page, I might say to myself, hey, how's the server been doing generally recently? And if I look at this request, slow request, well, if it hadn't been for these two guys, the last slow request I'd had today was at 5 o'clock this morning. And that would be, you know, some consolation to me to say, okay, well, separate from what the graphs tell me about the last minute or the last hour, I can also look at this and say, well, I haven't had a slow request since 5 o'clock this morning until I ran those two. And that's comforting for me. And then I had one at 4 a.m. And then look, I had a big jump to 5 o'clock yesterday. So I had, you know, several hours, almost 12 hours of no problem, no slow request. That's comforting. And then I could look also again at the IP addresses, see if there's any similarity, look at the applications if there's similarity, look at the URLs and query strings. And sure enough, I can see a bunch of issues with something about my blog, and I could dig into that later. But again, this is, for now, not the focus of the presentation. I just want you to get a sense of what, you know, that's the next one. Why are the requests slow? We'll cover that in the next part 2. But this is just to generally see what you can see. All right? So that's that. And I believe the next thing we were going to cover was the request history. I just want to get back to the graph. Yep, the error history. So that's a little bit different because you may not think of that readily when you're looking at things like recent and slow requests. There was this request error history, and it's relatively new. You may be looking at your FusionReactor and you don't have it. I don't remember when it came out, but it was somewhere in the 7 time frame. So the error history, this is the 100 most recent requests that had an error in the application. Now you may look and say, well, it has a 200. We'll come back to that in a second. But there's clearly some 404s and some 200s. You'll notice that if there's an error, FusionReactor has a link that says error. But also, if I didn't notice that, if I drilled into the request like we've seen before, when I drill into it, if there's an error, there'll be also a new tab called error details. So I can either click on that link on that previous page or on this page, or I can click here. They all take you to the same place. And this is, sorry, whatever error happened. And interesting, it just says an established connection was aborted. So this is a relatively obscure problem that happens, maybe more often than you think, where whatever made the request for the page, by the time this thing provided its response, the client had given up and moved on, clicked on another link. And the server tried to send to the browser the response, and the response couldn't be delivered because the client had given up and moved on. That's not a good thing. And in my case, it's kind of funny. I know maybe what the problem is. Any of you that have been to this page, it's my CF411. And it's just something that's grown and grown and grown over the years, literally for about 12 to 15 years. And it's now got 2,000 tools and resources. And it's just one big page. And I've got to get around to making a database generated. But the point is, that's a big page. And in fact, if I look at the main tab, one of the things I can see is the byte sent, 460K. That's not the end of the world, but it's 460K of content that's trying to be sent down to the browser. And if the browser gave up waiting for it, then I get this error. So that's that. Let's go back to the list of error requests and see there's clearly other ones. Now that's a 404. I'm not going to worry about that. That's something that says an error was triggered. I'm not going to worry about that. Clearly, these are bad guys trying to break in. And actually, it might also be Pete Freitag's Hack My CF. In fact, let's just take a look at that, because that's a pretty weird. I don't currently have Lucy on my server. So if we look at the headers, we'll see what the user agent is. And sure enough, it's Hack My CF. So if you guys don't know about that, that's a really cool tool, Pete Freitag. Go check out hackmycf.com. And he calls your server every week or two or something like that and tells you if there's vulnerabilities, and he's trying different things to break in. So I could ignore these from around 1221. Those were all clearly because of that. Now coming back down to here, again, 411 pages. So in my case, there's really not much for me to gain from looking at this. I generally know what most of them are about, but you might find something very different. All right, and let's try to get on, because I'm trying to get this presentation well under an hour so you guys can have time for questions. And I see screen falling 20 seconds behind voice. So somebody's complaining that the screen is falling 20 seconds behind the voice. I'll just tell you, David, nobody else has said that. So I would think that's on your end. You might have had a network congestion issue on your end. Hopefully it's caught up by now, but nobody else has complained of that. Wrapping up, I said that we could also see CPU and memory pages. So we've talked a bit about that, but I want to show you a couple of more useful bits about that. So if we come up here to the metrics, web metrics. Again, we talked about the CPUs up here, the memories up here. One thing I want you to see, with all of these graphs, there's a link underneath them. And if we click on that link, we change from looking at the current minute, or if we change this to the current hour, we change to going back as far as this instance has been up. In my case, up to a day and 30 minutes ago. So I'm going to click on the CPU graph. Link under the CPU graph is a link for CPU percentage. I've just clicked on that. And again, this should be instant and snappy. FusionReactor should never cause any overhead. So any slowness you see is either a network issue, or on my server there might be an issue right now, but it's never FusionReactor in all my years of working with it. If ever FusionReactor is what you think to be the cause of a problem, bring it to the support folks. I'll give you the email address at the end, and they would find out. I say we because I'm often working with people, and I'll have them check into that, and either I work with them or they report it to them and they work with them, and we find out what the real problem is. Anyway, so here we are on the CPU graph. Notice up here it's just about CPU, and I can click on these buttons like before and turn off the watching all CPU, watching just my instance, whatever. And then there's the hour view like we saw before, but then notice I can go back a day. And so now I'm looking at the whole day. And I can see if there's any trend changing in pattern. And sure enough, there is a bit of a change this morning since my 9 o'clock. And there might be something interesting about what happened at 4 o'clock yesterday. Now, some people have said, can I drill into these? No, unfortunately, you can't drill into them. What you can do is you can click on them and drag them and zoom in to look more closely at them. But there's no drill feature in FusionReactor currently. There is in FusionReactor Cloud. Again, this is not about FusionReactor Cloud. If you want to learn more about that, there was a webinar on FusionReactor Cloud. You can go check that out. So anyway, so this is the CPU graph. And if I had been up for a week, I could see back as far as a week. And normally my server is up for weeks at a time, but something happened yesterday morning. I'll look into that later. But I can only go back, therefore, to yesterday morning, not a week ago. But you might find you can go back a whole week. So that's the CPU graph. And again, that was all the graphs could be drilled into. I'm going to go back and look. I'm just hitting the back button to get back eventually to the metrics, web metrics. Remember, I've been clicking various buttons on this page. And, FusionReactor is just a browser thing, so you can use your browser back button to go back and forth. You can also bookmark things, like that's a particular URL for this particular page. You could bookmark that, mark favorites, things like that. But let's look at the memory. So first of all, if I go to this memory page, like with the CPU, I'll see what's going on recently. By default, it says the live view. And again, I really apologize for the slowness. I'm more inclined to think it's a network problem on my end. Anyway, so I can look at the hour and the day and see how memory usage has changed throughout the day. And that's the most recent hour, and that's okay. And we've got a whole webinar on understanding memory, but that's okay to me. And if we look at the day view, that's not really as abnormal as it might seem to some of you. That just showed that memory climbed and climbed and climbed, and it was either free and not so busy, or something had gathered up over time and finally finished. But I'm thinking if you look at the pattern, it's just almost perfectly, like it was finally free to take the time to do what's called a major GC. We'll get to the GCs in a moment. Anyway, that's that. But I want you to also see that over here on the left under resources, look, resources, there's heap, non-heap, and memory spaces. Let's talk about memory spaces. So FusionReactor can go further than just looking at the heap. Now, there are different parts of the heap. If you look down here, for those familiar with it, there's the Eden space and the survivor space and the old gen. And let's say I looked at the Eden space, and some of you may know what that is about, and again, see the webinar for more. But the Eden space is going up and down all the time, perfectly normal to even hit nearly the limit and then drop like a rock. And then we could see how that's changed over the day, and it might be that it really has just done the same thing all the time. Now, that's interesting that since 2 in the morning, the allocated amount has started to rise higher than the used amount. And that's interesting, but again, I wouldn't look at that and say I got a problem, but I might. Again, that's not the point of this webinar. But notice that you can look at that level of detail, and that's just the Eden space, one of 3 parts of the memory. The other part is the survivor space, and we'll see what that looks like at the day view. And that hasn't changed too much. And then the other part is the old gen, and things progress through the heap, going from the Eden to the survivor to the old. And again, that looks pretty reasonable to me. So I don't see myself having a problem, but you might see something quite different. And then there's these other parts of memory, like the metaspace. Some people have metaspace problems and don't understand it. And this is observing the use of the metaspace and the allocation of memory in the metaspace. And if you had the default setting that CoFusion, for instance, comes with of 192, you could have out of memory conditions because you ran out of metaspace, having nothing to do with heap. It wouldn't have shown up on the metrics, web metrics, because this is a unique, special part of memory, which again we talk about in the the webinar on memory. So anyway, check that out. That might be an interesting point for you. So look at all the cool stuff you can see. And then finally, the last thing we were going to talk about was garbage collection tracking. So again, back to FusionReactor. If you look over here, again in resources, one of the things in there is garbage collection. Resources, garbage collection. And it focuses on for most JVM garbage collection algorithms, there's 2 kinds of garbage collections that happen. Some people call them minor GCs and major GCs, depending on the algorithm. It might be called a scavenge versus a mark sweep. And this is the minor GCs, and this is the major GCs. And the top graph is showing how long are they taking. The middle graph is showing how often are they happening, and the bottom is how much memory are they freeing. Well, currently I don't have a lot of garbage collection going on, but let's look at the hour view and see if things are different. And for most people, it will look quite different. And then if we looked at the day view, maybe it would look still further different. Maybe not. But because we can see a little more green and blue, I'll just take advantage of this. So the green, remember, is minor GCs. And then the blue is major GCs. And down here, as I move along here, again, in yours, it might look very different. But in mine, if we just mouse along here and watch the top one, which is minors, they happen more often. Majors hardly ever happen. That's typical. And again, the blues are majors. So if we look right here at about 2:0 something, there it says the mark sweep activity went up to 0.2 per second. Well, that's not, that big of a deal, but there was a major that happened then. And when it happened, you can see straight up above that it took, whatever, if I put my mouse on the tip, it took about 30 milliseconds, it said. Again, remember, I could zoom in on this to make it a little easier. Well, this one, it seems I can't. Either my mouse isn't working, but I couldn't zoom in. But anyway, it said about 30 milliseconds. Again, that's not terrible. But and you can look at the graph and see this one was about 50-some milliseconds. And you can see that when the major GC ran, it did release a bit more memory. Not that much, 8 meg. Again, your numbers may look very different. You might see hundreds of megs being released. But the point is, whatever your numbers are, you can see how things have been going. And isn't that helpful? Sometimes people had no insight into whether garbage collections are happening or not. And to go back to, if you're trying to focus on, do we have a GC problem? If I'm in the live view, which is looking at about the last minute, do I see any happening? And if you wanted to, you could focus on only one type. So now there were no majors, but yes, there was a minor, and it just popped up before I clicked on these buttons. So we could see very clearly there was a minor GC, and it took about 100 milliseconds, and it freed about 300 meg. Anyway, so that's garbage collection. So isn't that cool? Now let me see, I have a delayed screen to voice as well, but that was at 9:40, that was 10 minutes ago. So that was just 2 people so far saying that. I hope that whatever it was only affecting a couple people. So there you go, whirlwind view of all the things you can do. And these are just some of them that can help you focus on troubleshooting. I hope it's helped some of you to appreciate what you can see, levels of detail that you maybe didn't imagine, and that you can use them to get started and sometimes even finding the solution to problems. And remember, this is just part 1, so it was a goal to go through quickly. I realize some people wish they could learn more. First, these are the remaining parts that will come up over the next several weeks. Troubleshooting part 1 was this one, what happened on my server. Then part 2 will be why are requests or transactions running slow. And by the way, I didn't get into it, but transactions are running queries and other sorts of things. We'll talk about that more in part 2. Then if those don't stand out, obviously, there's some other features that you could take advantage of that can dig in further into why requests are running slow. We'll cover that in part 3. And then, especially when you're saying, well, it's not going to help me now to look at it because it crashed, and then what happened before the crash, that will be covered in part 4 on post-crash troubleshooting. So we can see that it is very rich. And while to some people it can be overwhelming, if you just are aware at least of those few key features, that might help you. Let me get a drink just a second. Just knowing those few key features might help you. Now start thinking about questions you may want to ask, because we'll be concluding in just a moment. So we saw that the web metrics page gives you a great overview and at minute, hour, or even longer levels if you delve into it. The request pages show you great details on what requests are either running now or have run recently or were running slowly. The error page gives you details on the pages that had errors, including the error itself. You can track high-level resources like CPU and memory. And remember, that may not be your issue, so it's helpful to look at that and confirm, nope, that's not our problem. And then you can look at garbage collection, which, again, it might help you to prove that that's not your problem. But if it is a problem, then, again, go to the webinar on how to understand memory. And there are still more aspects of using FusionReactor to understand slow requests, including things like being alerted when things happened in the past before a crash, or even without a crash being alerted. And we're going to cover those sorts of things in the next 3 parts. But if you're anxious to get started and don't want to wait for those other ones to come, I want to point out that we've had these other webinars. I mentioned them. Let's just look at them really quickly. There was a getting started, and they're all available at fusion-reactor.com/webinars. And since 2016, these are the ones we've done. Getting started with it, configuring it, I've hinted at that one. Post-crash troubleshooting, so we did a whole webinar on that. Hidden gems in FusionReactor, and then when FusionReactor 6 came out, and I haven't done one on, oh yeah, down the bottom right is what's new in FusionReactor 7. But these are in the order in which they were presented. FusionReactor Cloud, getting the most out of the Ultimate Edition, troubleshooting, part 1. We'll talk more about what the other parts were in a moment. They were setting up the dashboard, for those who don't know what that is. Then post-crash troubleshooting, making the most of logs, and then memory troubleshooting, and then log analysis via Excel, and then FusionReactor 7, and then database troubleshooting. So we've covered a lot of these things in more detail in these various webinars. Each of them is about an hour long. You can go back and watch any of them. If one of these particular points you think is your issue, then go watch that webinar. And otherwise, come back next week or 2 weeks from now, and we'll continue with parts 2, and then later 3, and then 4, each about 2 weeks apart is the plan. Now, in the meantime, if you have further questions about FusionReactor, I just want you to realize you can go to the website, fusion-reactor.com. You can download the demo. You can download the product updates, things like that. You can find docs and other videos, tech notes. There's forums, a Google group, and much, much more. And if you just have a direct question you want to ask, you can send it right to the folks at sales or support at fusion-reactor.com. They're very open to answering questions. You'll find they're not like any, in my experience, they're not like any other company I've ever worked with, and that's why I love working with them. They're very responsive and real people that really want you to be happy with using the tool and really focused on it. And there's a US number for calling for sales-oriented questions. And then if you really need help understanding your problems in your server, they offer consulting, and they have a sister site called cfconsultant.com, and for the most part, if you go through them, you'll be passed to me ultimately. So you can either buy time through them, or I mentioned I have my own site. But anyway, the point is they have this sister site, CF Consultant, and we definitely welcome your feedback on these webinars. And if you have any ideas for other webinars you want to see, let us know. So with that, let's turn it now over to time for questions and answers. I saw one person say a couple minutes ago that they'd lost sound, but again, nobody else has said that, so I'll assume that was on their end. So anybody have any questions? Some positive feedback. And somebody saying they experienced dropouts as well. We'll see when we watch the recording, if the dropouts happen on the recording, then they were on my end. If they don't happen in the recording, then they were not on my end. Cool, so someone's looking forward to playing with it more. Is it possible to get a highlighted mouse pointer? So just out of curiosity, could people see my mouse pointer? I get that you may be saying you wish it was more clear, but could some people at least see my mouse at all when I was moving it around? Well, that's weird. So some people said yes, some people said no. So clearly it was small. I'll look into that. That's interesting that, you know, in all 15 webinars, nobody else had pointed that out. I don't know what would be different now. Maybe a high resolution monitor. So yeah, thank you for that feedback. I'll look into that. Good deal. People generally saying they're looking forward to trying things out. Thank you. Kind regards. Thank you for that. There's a question asking, do they have support for older versions of ColdFusion? Absolutely. What version are you on? I think you'll find it works all the way back even to FusionReactor 6. Thank you for the kind regards. Nathan asked, are they all LTS? Now that's long-term support, but I'm not sure what you mean. Long-term support of ColdFusion, of Java, of FusionReactor? So you said you're working on ColdFusion 8. Yep, you can definitely run FusionReactor with ColdFusion 8. And I've never seen any indication that said when support for a particular CF release would stop. Usually I haven't seen them stop supporting releases, but I'll say that's a great question to send to the support address. So again, support at fusion-reactor.com if you have such specific details, or sales. That's actually a good sales question about licensing and versions supported. So send to sales at fusion-reactor.com. Sometimes when we have an issue, we have a hint that a restart can fix it, so we do it immediately. And sometimes it fixes the problem. Then we want to dig into the root and restart the instance, clean it up, and look back. So to be clear, no, all the things I showed today would not be able to show you what went on before the crash. Now, I said this in passing, but let me make the point really clear. So what I showed today was focused on what's going on now or recently back to the time of a restart. But as I said a couple times, if the instance restarts, then everything I showed you would be wiped out. But I said that there was a feature called Archive Metrics, which we'll cover in part 4. And that will talk about showing you graphically, and for you guys that have been using FusionReactor a long time, hear this, with the new Archive Metrics that was introduced in 7.2 And it's up there under metrics, archive metrics, or it was in the bottom right of the web metrics page as a button that said archive metrics. With that archive metrics, you would be able to look at what went on before the crash. It graphs the logs. FusionReactor has many logs, and most of them are pretty straightforward and easy to understand. But the cool thing is that archive metrics lets you page back through time up to 30 days by default. FusionReactor keeps its logs for 30 days. And so you'd be able to look at those graphically using the archive metrics. Cool. Somebody thanking me for the metaspace information. As for how to change the metaspace, you would look at the JVM configuration for whatever app you're using. So if you're in Lucy, it would be in the JVM configuration for Tomcat. If you're in Cold Fusion, on the Java and JVM page. And then if you're in Tomcat, you'd be using the JVM configuration tools for that. And on Linux, it'd be editing a file. In Windows, you'd be looking at the Tomcat 8W exe, running that, and it's got an interface for changing JVM arguments. And the JVM argument for the metaspace is called the max metaspace size. And again, I don't have time now to get into this, but for many people, the easy answer is to take it out. If you take out the max metaspace size, then the JVM is free to use available memory, not in the heap, but available memory on the box for the metaspace. And it's not usually that it needs much. And there's this artificial constraint in a lot of app servers where people have put it in, because it used to be in Java 7, you needed a max perm size. Again, I don't want to get into this in detail now, but if you're on Java 8 or above, unlike in 7 below, where you needed a max perm size to raise above its very low default, with Java 8 and above, the max metaspace has no default. If you take it out, it's free to use as available memory. So I would just take it out. And if you have more questions about that, again, reach out for support or consulting, especially to get that done. Let me just look over the questions we'll be covering. Yes, alerts. So again, I said this in passing. Sorry if you missed it. Alerts will be covered in part 4. Post-crash troubleshooting. I'll mention it in that discussion. I know that's about while it's happening as well, but that will be covered in there. Keeping up with maintenance. So somebody asked, do you recommend keeping up with maintenance? By which I assume you mean FusionReactor updates. And yes, certainly it's always in your interest to keep up with the updates. And there's a maintenance plan you can buy. If you get FusionReactor on a monthly basis or annual basis, maintenance is included. If you buy the perpetual license, then you have the option to pay for maintenance, and that gives you the right to update it beyond major updates. So minor updates are free for everybody, but minor updates for whatever version you licensed. Anyway, I don't want to get into too much detail about that. I don't know that we've had a presentation specifically on doing updates, but there is a button. Let me just show this real quickly, because it's a good point to make clear. Many people don't notice this, and I've pleaded with the engineers to make it more obvious. Up in the top left corner is a FusionReactor menu, FusionReactor, and then there's About. At the bottom of that page is About. And at the bottom of that page, it shows you what version you're on. 7.4.3 is the current latest version. I happen to be running on that latest version. And if you're on anything older than that, then you want to update. And if you're on, a version 7 or above, I'm pretty sure that anybody that's on 7 above, the license they have would allow them to update to 7.4.3. If you were on 6, then whether you could update to 7 would depend on whether you're on an annual plan or if you've paid for maintenance. But let's not get into the details there. Let me just say this, that there's a link right there that says check for FusionReactor updates. If you can't see my mouse, I'm talking about right underneath this box, there's a link that says check for FusionReactor updates. And when you click that link, it passes your version and your serial number for FusionReactor to their server, and it'll tell you, based on their understanding of your maintenance and support and stuff, whether you can get the update for free and what version is available. So yeah, everybody should be clicking that every once in a while to make sure that they're up to date. I would definitely recommend that. Back to the questions, and we'll try to wrap up in a moment. Awesome. Oh goodness, someone says I'm really breaking up, but nobody else is saying that, Daniel, so I'm going to assume that's on your end. Unrelated to FusionReactor, but I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on Adobe's recent statement of Java 8 licensing, especially after the release of 2.01. Hoping for a blog post. Well, I have done a blog post about that. And if anybody that's interested in this discussion, there was this week or late last week, an Adobe blog post announcing that they're going to license Java 11 and Java 8 updates for ColdFusion users. So you won't have to pay Oracle for those. And if you don't know what I mean by that, I did a blog post on that. If you go to my site, which is carehart.org, and look at the blog, you'll see that among the top most recent 4 or 5 blog posts were a few talking about this whole issue of Oracle's change in licensing, about Java 8 updates and Java 11 in production. So anyway, check that blog post out. Good news for people using ColdFusion is that Adobe is licensing it for us. All right, well, that's it for the questions, and we're right about at the time. I mean, we had to start over, so we're at exactly an hour since we started over. So great. I'm glad folks had a good time. Thank you for the kind comments, and we'll look forward to seeing you for parts 2, 3, and 4 starting in 2 weeks. It'll be 2 weeks from tomorrow, not 2 weeks from today, but 2 weeks from tomorrow. And if you go again to fusion-reactor.com/webinars, you can sign up for the subsequent parts. And again, let us know feedback if you have any. I'll just put back on the screen real quickly the contact information. So maybe take a screenshot of that if you didn't. If you have any other questions that have come up that weren't answered today, take a screenshot of that, and I'll leave it there for a moment. And with that, I'll say thanks to everybody until the next time.